Hello, everyone. We're going to let people settle into their room. We'll get started in just a second. Thanks, everyone, for being so patient. And thanks for being here this afternoon, evening. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Caoilinn in Conversation, where Caoilinn Hughes seeks out the finest writers in the UK, from the UK and Ireland, and chats with them about their most recent novel. We cannot thank Caoilinn enough for the incredible array of writers that she has had on over the last 2 years or so, and today is no different. Caoilinn will be in conversation with Kamila Shamsie, whose new novel, Best of Friends, has been creating a ton of buzz all year and recently released here in the States. Our good friend and Exile staff member, Beth Golay, interviewed Kamila recently on her very popular NPR podcast, Marginalia. So after you listen to this, get a double dose and go listen to Marginalia's podcast. Of course, Beth raved about Kamila and Best of Friends, so you are in for a treat today. Let's meet our guest. Kamila Shamsie is the author of several novels, most recently Home Fire, previous to Best of Friends, which won the Women's Prize for Fiction, was long listed for the Booker Prize. It was a finalist for the International Dublin Literary Award, the Costa Novel Award, and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature, among other honors. She was raised in Karachi and lives in London. Of course, Kamila will be in conversation with Caoilinn Hughes, whose latest novel, The Wild Laughter, won the 2021 Royal Society of Literature's Encore Award and is a perennial Exile favorite. Her first novel, Orchid and the Wasp, won the Collier-Bristow Prize and was a finalist for 4 of the prizes. Her short fiction won the Moth Short Story Prize, the Irish Book Award Story of the Year, and a No Henry Prize. Before we get started, I would ask that those of you tuning in this afternoon to please mute yourselves, but keep your cameras on so that our guests don't feel like they're speaking into a void. Type any questions you might have into the chat, and Caoilinn will ask them of Kamila around the 45-minute mark. You can purchase signed copies of Best of Friends and Wild Laughter through the link in the chat, or go to exileinbookville.com. We ship throughout the US. Well, please help Exile in welcoming Kamila Shamsie and Caoilinn Hughes, and please enjoy the show. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Javier. It is lovely to be here and to be back with Exile in Bookville. It feels like it's been a while, although it probably hasn't. Just time is doing that weird dilation ever since COVID. So I am delighted to speak with Kamila Shamsie. I have been a fan. I kind of read I've read 4 of Kamila's novels in the wrong order. So I read Home Fire when everyone was reading it, and then subsequently went back to Burnt Shadows and A God in Every Stone, and was delighted to get an early copy of this new book. And it seems to me just an ideal follow-on from Home Fire, kind of carrying on some of the themes that are in that book, but with a very, very different treatment, and kind of almost taking a different trajectory from a similar kind of terrain of ideas. So just to kind of mention some of I'm sure that the readers and the customers of Exile in Bookville will know of Home Fire already, but that novel really kind of broke Kamila out into the American readership. I believe that Riverhead published it in the US in 2017, and it won just a whole host of prizes, as well as being one of the BBC's most influential books ever. But today we're talking about Best of Friends, which Ali Smith, I don't know how well Ali Smith is known among American readers, but she's an incredible stylist, a Scottish writer, and really, really kind of the pinnacle of writing about the contemporary world, the contemporary moment. She's even kind of leaned into that in writing books almost set in the very present moment. And Ali Smith says of Best of Friends that it's a shining tour de force about a long friendship's respects, disrespects, loyalties, and moralities. And I think, like the 4 of Kamila's novels that I've read, it has the wonderful effect of bringing the reader up against their own assumptions. And I think that's something that I search for as a reader. Sometimes those assumptions are ugly, and sometimes they're rose tinted. Kamila, you've been published in the UK since you were 25, if I get that correctly. So presumably you must have written that book when you were 22, 23. But you've more recently been brought to the US readers, as I just mentioned, with your latest book. And I think later on we'll probably come on to think about American readership, and also South Asian readership. But I wanted to ask about that first publication in the UK, I believe with Granta, which was discombobulatingly published while you were doing an MFA in the US at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Did you feel kind of triangulated in that moment?
No, I just felt thrilled that someone was publishing me. First of all, thank you for hosting this, and to those of you who are here to listen. So I was finishing up my MFA at the University of Massachusetts. And in fact, it was the 10th of December, 1997, when I got called from my agent who was in London to say, Granta wants to publish your novel. And I was 6 months away from, graduating. I had no real sense of what would happen to my life, once I left Massachusetts and left America. I was heading home to Karachi. And it was just this sort of miracle of a thing that, I'm going to be a published writer. And the publication didn't actually happen until I had finished the program, because that might have been weird to be in the middle of an MFA program and have your book come out. But in fact, it was a sort of a nice sort of way of saying goodbye to America and the MFA program, was to have this publication pending.
Well, it definitely would have been intimidating, I think, for your peers.
Well, there was this nice moment when I turned up for my thesis defense, and my thesis advisor, the wonderful writer John Edgar Wideman, said, well, what are we going to say to you? No one will publish this. But yeah, no, it was a gift. It really was.
And you were celebrated as a Granta Best Young British Novelist. I had a very lucky and fluky moment in 2014 when I had a poem in Best Young British, or Best British Poems 2014, and I didn't say a word. Now I'm Irish. Technically, I should have rejected it. Like I think Seamus Heaney rejected such an accolade. But you were, of course, living in London at the time, or I don't know, had you already become a British citizen?
So no, I was, when that list came out in 2013, I was both the oldest young novelist, because the cutoff was you had to be, sort of for people who were 40 and under. And I think there were 3 of us who were born in 1973 who just about made it. And we worked out from birthdays, I was the oldest. But I was also the least technically British, because I was, at that point, I think it was about 3 or 4 months away from officially becoming a British citizen. So I was sort of, far into the process, and I knew that I, had to submit the paperwork. But technically it hadn't quite happened. Though there was precedent for this, which was Kazuo Ishiguro, when he was on the original Best of Young British Novelist list, he wasn't yet British. And later when Yi Yun Lee got onto the Best of Young American Novelist, she wasn't yet technically American. So there's a nice little loophole for a few of us who are almost there, but not quite.
No, but I mean, I think it's a lovely, it's I think a really important way of feeling like you belong to a country to a degree, that kind of literary embrace. I mean, it's almost, I would imagine, almost more important than the kind of technical paperwork side, But so your first novel, and that kind of moment of having this discovery, from a far-flung place, maybe, when you were so young, was certainly a young woman coming into power, coming into her power, her particular power. And that's really what one of the things that this novel is about. Maybe we could start with, because you mentioned that if you're going to do a reading, it would be kind of from when the characters are younger. So it might be a nice idea to do the reading now.
Sure. So the novel starts in 1988 in Karachi. And it's 2 14-year-old girls, Maryam and Zahra. They're 14, but they're already 10 years into their friendship. But they're at that age, 14, where things are changing and bodies are changing. And this is where we pick it up. This is on the first day back at school. Maryam has been in London for her summer holidays and has just come back. It had been happening since last year without anyone but Maryam and her tailor taking much notice, but London had accelerated it. All that chocolate and ice cream and fast food had settled in unexpected places and brought with it the discomfort of underwired bras and a body that felt unknown. For a while in London, she thought she had lost the ability to judge her own dimensions, which is why her breasts kept bumping into strangers, until she realized it was almost never women with whom she was making the unexpected contact. Once understood, she didn't know how she felt about it. Sometimes she wanted to cry, other times she was triumphant. It was purely humiliating, though, to overhear her father tell her mother that she needed to go to Oxford Street and buy their daughter an entirely new wardrobe because all her clothes looked indecent. So out went her favorite shirts, the Madonna one, the tiger with diamante eyes one, the nautical striped one. The new shirts were looser fitting and without images or ornamentation that might draw people's eyes to her chest. It made little difference to the men bumping into her on the it made little difference to the men bumping into her on the tube, or to that friend of her parents who'd started squeezing her shoulders affectionately and pulling her close the way her uncles had always done, but never him. The previous summer in London, she had imagined visibility was what she wanted. In Karachi, men stared if you were a girl. It was something to which she was accustomed and shared with every other girl in the city. In London, people looked through you. The contrast was disquieting. Notice me, notice me, notice me, she chanted internally when walking down the street. And now, wish granted, she had passed into a new category of person, her relationship to the world around her altered. At the same time, everything seemed to carry on as it always had. There was no one in London she could talk to about this. Only on that first day of school, during break time, watching Zahra reach over the heads of students standing in front of her to pay the man in the tuck shop for 2 bottles of Coke and 2 packets of chili chips, did it all make sense. There had always been a joke at the heart of their friendship, a gag that appeared first at the visual level before revealing itself to run through many layers. Now there was Zahra, all straight lines, and Maryam, all curves, adding another element to their study in contrast. She wondered if Zahra shared this feeling of completeness when they were together that could surely only be possible when you'd been friends with someone since the age of 4 and your character had been defined by the other. She suspected not. There were things Zahra wanted from the world that Maryam didn't understand, things she found in books and in her own mind, which sometimes wandered far away from Maryam into places she rarely talked about because she knew Maryam couldn't follow her there. When Zahra did say things like, "Do you think everyone has a purpose in life? Or do we invent purpose to stop feeling irrelevant?" Maryam never knew how to answer. She didn't know which part of the question made less sense to her, purpose or irrelevant. She had tried to come up with an answer, something to do with wanting to expand her family's business into the international market, and Zahra had frowned and said, "That's ambition, not purpose." Stop there.
That's gorgeous. So this is actually the novel's quite evenly weighted between the one part of the novel is it's set in 1988 in Karachi, and then the other part in London in 2020, and they're fairly evenly weighted, the two kind of narratives in the novel. Was there ever a point where you thought that this could be a novel completely set in 1988 or in around those years? Was there ever an iteration of it that dwelled on that moment of their young womanhood?
No, it was always a novel that was going to be about what happened to this very close childhood friendship, where we first see it as there are certain tensions that are evident, but they're 14, and the fact that they both love George Michael and the novels of Jackie Collins sort of outweighs the fact that their families see power very differently and they have different kind of understandings of the world. And the novel was always then going to move them into adult life, where George Michael isn't quite enough of a glue to hold you together. And actually the ways in which they're different, they're now old enough for that to really have an impact in the way they are in the world. And I want to put that stress on the friendship and sort of see what would happen to it. And actually for me, a lot of sort of what was propelling the novel was I didn't know what would happen to it. I mean, I really, to me, there was a question right until the end of what will happen to this friendship when they are adult women with power now in the world, and they're no longer just absorbing and responding to or reflecting on, how the adults are behaving. They are the adults now.
Yeah. So there was the trigger. I can the large one I can imagine for wanting to write this novel would have been wanting to write about friendship. But I wonder if there was more kind of I know with in an interview I heard about home fire, and even actually I think in the packaging of the book itself it mentions Antigone as being one of the kind of source pieces of inspiration for that book, and actually a kind of a very literal trigger by a theatre director suggesting that you do an adaptation of it. And so there you can pinpoint a kind of a moment of birth for that novel. Did this novel have a similar? Was there kind of one detail or kind of instance of the friendship that came into your mind that you thought that, or was it more just generally wanting to write a novel that started from a position of exploring friendship?
There were, sometimes a novel comes from a single thing and sometimes it is various things coalescing. So there was, for a long time I'd wanted to write a novel of childhood friendships. And that had started when I was in my 20s, and my sister said, the friends we make in adult life are our friends because we have something in common. But our childhood friends are our friends because they've always been our friends. And the older I got, the more that struck me as true. And I think about it. And then 2016 happened. And between Brexit on one side of the Atlantic and Trump on the other, there were a lot of conversations where people were saying, I can no longer talk to this person who has always been in my life because we're on opposite sides of this divide. And the novel is at its most comfortable in a very sort of intimate domestic space. And the novel doesn't want to think that actually the fact that you may vote differently is going to be what will pull you apart. Within the novel, it's always that there's something very personal and intimate that happens. And I found myself thinking, but of course, if you're looking at someone and the fact that they say, oh, I back this side rather than that side of an argument, makes you think about the ways in which you're different. And makes you maybe think the thought, I'm not sure I like you. That is as intimate and personal as it gets. And that when we talk about, oh, well, you don't let politics get in the way of friendship, this odd thing which no one in Pakistan ever says, but people in other parts of the world say, you're sort of ignoring the fact that politics is just a kind of one of the ways in which people are telling you who they are and what they believe in. And so I found myself again returning to that conversation of my sisters and thinking, yeah, I want there to be these two girls who really do love each other and always have and rely on each other. But they really like who the other one is within the friendship. But they know there are other versions of this person they love. And some of the versions of the person they love is someone who either they disdain, have contempt for, look down upon, dislike. And I thought I want to find a way to bring that into the novel. And I didn't know for quite a while what that difference would be and how it would come about. But there was another thing which had been in my head for a long time, which was this idea of what it is to be a woman living in a woman's body. And there's a word that comes up in the novel quite early on, which is girl fear. And it's funny, I've talked to a number of women about this book, and women from around the world, and they'll say, oh, tell me about the book. And I'll say, well, there are these two, teenagers, they're girls, and they find themselves in a situation, and they're with these young men who they don't know well, one of them they don't know at all. And there's that moment where it's sort of exciting and thrilling and tinged with possibility. and then suddenly it becomes terrifying. And every woman I've spoken to says, oh yeah, I know that moment. And so I wanted to put that in there as well, in this idea of how, as quite young women, we recognize fear and vulnerability. And I was interested in the question of what happens to the girls who have this moment of fear and vulnerability at 14, when actually they grow up and they are powerful, but they're still living in the female body, and that fear and vulnerability is still there. How does that interact with power, with the power they have? And what happens if that girl fear of 14, that inciting incident, what if they don't really leave it behind, but it follows them through their life, and they have to then, as grown, adult, powerful women, have to confront again their 14-year-old terrified selves? How do they respond?
Yeah, because it never does. I mean, leave your life, really, those moments. And because, you know, they learn so much about themselves and about each other. And you know, the perhaps even later on nauseating power which they invoked, you know, in the moment in order to, you know, to protect themselves if they could. Those power balances are already, you know, not quite even between the two friends.
Yeah. And there is, of course, because there are always different kinds of structures of power. So even though there is that moment of terror, but in the moment right after that, there's class, you know, and class is one of the structures of power. And the boy who terrified them has less power than certainly one of them, but actually both of them do, in terms of what you can get via having the power of certain social status and everything that comes with it, the connections that come with it, the possibilities that come with it. So I wanted to look at that as well. So it's not a simple case of, you know, the girls have no power, the men have the power. It's actually, there are different kinds of power dynamics, and they will work against each other. So there's one kind of power to do with gender, there's another kind of power to do with class.
Yeah. And you know, they don't really have a kind of a political awakening in that moment or in the book in general. I mean, it's one of the maybe one of the privileges they haven't grown up with, to have ever had a period of being politically asleep. But I thought that was kind of interesting that, you know, in the portrait of these young women in Pakistan, they're already very aware of their capital and what, you know, what should be the neutral the neutral kind of scenarios that should play out for them, in which wouldn't be neutral necessarily for other people. They're both privileged, you know, the two central characters, Zahra and Maryam, but not to the same level. So they're the two families have a different relationship to power, and I suppose I wondered whether you thought that might actually be the thing that's more difficult to transcend than political differences, as in ideological differences, those power dynamics. You know, with that question earlier, that you know, platitude earlier on, you were saying that people throw around about don't let politics get in the way of a good friendship. Can you say the same for don't let, you know, relationships with power?
I think it's hard for them to in the case of two of them, it is hard to separate out the class element from the politics element, because Maryam grows up in that very, very tiny band of the elite, which really does exist in every country I know. I mean, I don't know all the countries of the world, but they have class immunity. And I know, you know, sort of Britain and Pakistan are countries where class is much more overt and on the surface. In America, it's talked about much less, but it is so much there. I mean, I remember when I first went to university in America, and I didn't know how to read class in America. And my college roommate years later said, didn't you realize that all the kids who were on financial aid hung out together and knew each other, and you knew who was and who wasn't, and it was very much a sort of money, but from that class divide that went on. And so in this case, Maryam lives in that narrow band that has class immunity, which means, or thinks she does. Of course, no one has total immunity, but she belongs to those people who think the rules aren't for them. The law isn't for them, because they can always pick up a phone call to someone really important who can bend the rules for them or make sure they get out of trouble. And Zahra, although her family is, they're middle class, they don't have to worry about how to pay the bills. They are not struggling. She's going to a quite elite private school, but they aren't in that band of class immunity. They're journalists and teachers, and their friends include other journalists and human rights activists who are going to prison and who are being flogged for standing up to, publicly flogged, and this did happen, for standing up to military rule. And that just means that their relationships to power, the two girls, are very, very different from the start. And so there is no separating out the class from the politics in their case.
Yeah. And they both, I mean, if there's a democratizing factor, but in their move to the UK, they both become migrants.
Yeah.
So there is, theoretically, you would think a change in the relationship to citizenship and kind of power in that. They're both also Muslim women in Britain, which is kind of a new terrain for them both. It's not the same. There is a very different and interesting kind of the ways in which the two characters use their identity in one way or another, there's I think a really, really fascinating discussion about the role of exploiting diversity, and that kind of question that is just done so brilliantly in this book. That's quite a difficult topic to portray, and could only really be portrayed in characters of extreme privilege within that context. They both take up very different jobs in the UK, and I mean, so was that really kind of in the writing process and imagining how friendship could survive these kind of choices? I wonder, had you written scenes where there'd been a more overt discussion between the two characters of that conscious kind of use of themselves?
This is a question that a writer knows to ask another writer. Yeah, I mean, there were lots of early drafts had many overt and explicit conversations, which later you realize first they wouldn't have these conversations this late into their friendship. They might have had them 15 years ago. But also that I wanted to show the way they're sort of differently aware of what it is to be migrant Muslim female. I mean, Maryam sort of objects to the word migrant because she feels that in Britain, there's this sort of taint of desperation to it, and she says, well, why can't I be an expat or an emigre? And it is, I mean, those are terms that are so loaded, again, in terms of class, often in terms of race. So Americans are more likely to be called expats, whereas Pakistanis are more likely to call migrant. But also, if you have a certain level of money, then maybe you're more an expat than you are a migrant. And it's just the way in which she thinks about how that language is used, and she's very conscious that it is a moment in time where you can exploit the fact that all kinds of organizations, and in fact even political parties, want to tick certain diversity boxes without changing anything about the ways they operate. And she sort of presents herself forward as saying, okay, I'll be that person. You can use me to tick the diversity box. I won't ask you to change the way you are, but you'll have to do me certain favors in return. And because she is, I think we can say this, I've given too much away. She's a venture capitalist and political donor, whereas her friend Zahra works in the world of civil liberties and human rights, and very much sees herself. Yes, she is successful. Yes, she's powerful. She has all kind of privileges going for her, and she enjoys them. I mean, she enjoys the fact that she's a successful and quite well-known public figure. But she also is conscious that she can use what she has on behalf of people who, are the wrong kind of diverse for the government. Their presence is not adding to anyone's coffers, and they are seen as sort of political footballs to be kicked around.
Yeah, I'm going to come on to that with what Zahra's job is, just to say also that the subtlety of dealing with Maryam then kind of passing as straight as being kind of one at a certain point, you know, it's just so subtly done to show that there is a kind of an equation that she's worked out there, and there's a tipping point where all of a sudden the dominoes, you know, so carefully constructed, can fall down. But with Zahra's role as the head of a civil liberties organization, she comes to the aid of refugees, but also people who have been granted citizenship and who are potentially having that citizenship revoked, which you know is also something that this novel kind of isolates. Say in contrast to some of your previous books, we get a glimpse into a detention center at a certain point. And I understand you've worked with a group yourself called Refugee Tales. I wonder, could you tell us about that, and whether or not you kind of drew on any of that for Zahra's role?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. Refugee Tales is a remarkable project, and you can go into Google and look up Refugee Tales to find more about them. And it started with actually a group called the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group. And Gatwick is, you know, as I know, you know, an airport in England, but right next to the airport is a detention center for migrants whose leave to remain has been denied, or their visas have been cancelled, and they're about to be put on planes and removed, is the word, from the country. And they're in these detention centers, which are just awful places. And the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group started because there were people, English people, who lived around Gatwick, who said, well, there's this awful detention center, and there are people who are being isolated, and many of them have no one. Maybe we can go and visit them. And it literally started with this very neighborly act of, well, we live around here, let's go and to these people who have no one and see if we can offer anything. And from there, it sort of, you know, sprung all kinds of other tributaries. And one of them is this project called Refugee Tales, which pairs up writers with people who are in some way in that detention process, in many cases detainees, and the writers tell their tales. And I was paired up with someone who's a detainee who'd been in this detention center and had his asylum claim refused and denied before it was finally granted. And I've done quite a lot of work with them in different ways, and became interested in that, you know, just the awfulness and the brutality and really the cruel side of Britain and how it treats these people. And when I was writing the book, I very much wanted to go into a detention center, because there is, to me, one of the more significant scenes in the novel is when Zahra goes to visit one. But because it was COVID, they weren't allowing anyone in. So I spoke to someone from Refugee Tales who had spent a lot of time in these centers and literally said, Anna, you need to talk me through exactly what happens and exactly what it looks like. And she has been going for so many years and is such a sensitive, thoughtful, perceptive human being that she basically just, you know, I almost want to sort of, you know, record what she wrote, what she said to me, and put that in there. But yeah, that was very much, you know, part of what went on is this question of, you can choose who to ally yourself with. You know, is it the people within the detention centers, or is it the people who are putting people into the detention centers?
Yeah. And there's room to take that action as a British citizen. I often think, you know, I've been lucky to live in countries that have proportional representation. So I always think, you know, I think one of the most difficult things about living in the US or in the UK would be the fact that you feel so robbed of your tools as a citizen.
Yeah, very much. You know, so you have to find different kinds of tools, basically.
Yeah. One of the aspects that, you know, it comes up through that story of the man Zahra is dealing with is some of the consequences of the surveillance culture in the UK. It's a surveillance kind of society, and also the nexus that it has with social media. And I know nothing about what surveillance is like in Pakistan or even the use of kind of social media there. But I know growing up in Ireland, we always thought of CCTV as being a very English thing, like that there'd be cameras on the streets. Where in Ireland, it was always kind of in shops and in banks, and always for the purposes of theft. There wasn't that kind of. It's hard to know. I was born in 1985, so it's hard to know how much that was to do with say being a kid in the 90s, and what it would be like if it was a decade later. But I'm interested, to hear about whether that's something that would completely translate across Pakistan and the UK, and of course in the UK there is this use almost of social media, in the novel as it's presented in as the UK is presented in the novel, this use of social media as a kind of weapon. Which is very truthful, I think, as a kind of device for regulating people's citizenship. I wonder if there's something you want to say about that, and if you kind of engage with social media as well yourself as a writer, kind of aware of this weaponry, this potential for being used as a weapon. I know you had this great phrase with your last book, Googling while Muslim, where you're kind of hindered to even research your own novel for fear of that kind of Google history being kind of used against you. So that's come back again in this novel.
I was sort of quite struck in living in London about certain kind of echoes and continuities that come up from my childhood in Pakistan. And one of them has to do with this idea of the surveillance state. I mean, when I was growing up, Pakistan was under dictatorship. And you were always very aware that when you were speaking on the telephone, you had to be very careful because anyone could be listening in. And there was always this idea that the state was always listening in. Although we know now, and the state certainly didn't have the technology in the 80s in Pakistan to know if 15-year-old me was saying the president is awful, but we lived as though that were the case. And so this idea of you can only say certain things when you are indoors in spaces with people you're very sure of, was always that case growing up. And then I moved to the UK. And there was increasing talk about the surveillance state in this bill called the Snoopers Charter, and the way in which Britain might use its surveillance technology. And first was just this case that there's CCTV everywhere in London, so you're always being watched. But I think particularly sort of post 9/11 and 7/7, it became this question of how is that being used by the government. And when social media came along, it was this interesting moment where I actually realized that a lot of people want to be seen. So there's a moment where in the novel, the two women, Maryam and Zahra, having this sort of argument because Maryam is a venture capitalist and one of her, her babies is this social media company called Image, which is, a little bit like Instagram, but best known for its incredible facial recognition technology, which, as far as the way they sell it is, it's a way to tag yourself and your friends in pictures. And Zahra is very, very disturbed by this facial tagging. And Maryam says to her, but look, there's an opt-out feature in the app. And most people don't use it because people want to be seen. They want to be recognized. It's, what you see as surveillance, they see as visibility. And I think we are living in this moment where, people are wanting to project more and more of themselves out in the world and be seen everywhere. I mean, you go to concerts and people, rather than looking at the stage, they're checking that, they're looking at their phone, which is looking at the stage, to make sure that they're framing it correctly. And quite what that means for how we live is an interesting one. I mean, the way I work with social media is I assume that everything I put out there is just visible to everyone, whether I have privacy settings on or not. I assume not. And it should be said, last week I had to apply for an American visa, and one of the visa questions is give us all your social media profiles. Right.
Yeah.
It's a very clear thing. We, as this state, if before we let you in, we need to know who you are on social media and have the ability to go in and check on you. You know, that's just a fact of where we are in life now.
Yeah. And do you kind of, so do you do kind of take a minimal approach yourself?
It's not so much a minimal approach. Well, I mean, I don't put images of myself up. But I mean, I also engage in it in some places. It's sort of, think of it as the fun market square. It's great in moments. I'll go on there and tweet about cricket because other Pakistani cricket fans will be watching the same game as me, and we can all have the same moment of joy or sorrow. And sometimes, you want people to know something you've seen, but I use it very much as you might think about, standing on a box in a park and yelling out.
I heard you say of Home Fire that the social media kind of presence in that book acts as a kind of Greek chorus. It certainly has a presence here, but the Greek subtext isn't there, I don't think, but it's there in another sense, also intergenerationally. You can kind of feel that even between the dynamic between Maryam and the Prime Minister, you can feel these kind of levels of savviness and power there as well. But I recently saw a production in Edinburgh of Liz Lochhead, the Scottish poet, an adaptation of Medea, and it really felt like this kind of social media kind of commentary and backlash and waves and of all these voices around the room. I was really reminded somehow there was kind of a nexus forming with your work in the way that social media is used. There weren't any kind of devices in that, but it was coming in to say something of the automatic kind of ripple effect of saying anything on a digital platform or in a way where it's being recorded.
I mean, of course, the other thing we know as writers is that ripple effect, occurs everywhere, and that you work in an office, the ripple effect is going to be. You're in a family, the ripple effect is going to work there. But it's the way that it's been magnified now on social media, and the fact that it's possible on social media to have a sense of intimacy. You can be just replying to one person and feel you're in a conversation with that person, but of course you're not, because it's also a public forum. So there's this interesting mix of it being this sense of intimacy, and yet this extreme publicness.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's vulnerability there too, obviously, not just on a political level, but I just want to say that if audience members want to ask questions, because there's loads that I'm thinking of that I want to ask you about, Kamila, but I'll just have a peek. I've gotten our screen squished so that I can just see you and me, because otherwise, let me see in the chat. Okay, so now's the time to type in questions, folks, if you have any, and I'll try and keep my eye on them if they pop up. But so I guess we were talking there about ripple effects, and to kind of segue a little bit, so this is kind of a dual narrative. I'm not sure how it feels to me as if it was given that Zahra's story point of view is given a greater percentage than Maryam's, but I'm not sure if that's actually true, or if okay, that's saying something about me. But of the novels that I've read of yours, there are almost always multiple point of views. I know Home Fire had 4. There's often kind of an interweaving structure, and I wonder whether that says something about maybe a little bit of skepticism about the possibility for monologue or a single narrative to do any kind of justice to a story.
There's that great John Berger line, which writers keep repeating: never again will a single story be told as though it were the only one. And I think that, you know, has been very deep in this, in what the way I've been constructing these narratives, is that I'm so interested in the fact that we can see the same thing differently. Having said that, I was thinking the other day, next novel, single point of view, just because I've now done 4 that, you know, have roamed around in this way.
Well, the worst thing would be for us to be consistent. We have to keep confusing them.
Yeah. But no, I am very, very interested in that idea of, you know, you look at one thing through one person's eyes and you think, oh, okay, and then you see that same thing through someone else's eyes, and that someone else could be a sibling or a partner or a best friend or a lover, and you think there would be more overlap, and in some cases can be an interesting overlap, and then there's this extraordinary dissonance in the way people who have reasons to see things similarly really don't.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I'll be very interested to see what happens if you shift to the single point of view. It can be just a refreshing thing when you're starting a new novel to make it feel different from the last. But you've obviously it's been part of the interest of the books, not just a formal choice. One thing I might have got wrong. So your first publisher was Granted. Did you also have a publisher in South Asia at the time? Did you have an Indian publisher at some point?
From the beginning, Penguin India did the first novel, and then for a while there was a separate Pakistani publisher as well, Oxford University Press. So yeah, from the first novel.
Okay. I heard you say in an interview at Shakespeare & Co. something that I thought was really interesting, that you said if the British novel is a little averse to writing about contemporary politics and prefers, this isn't verbatim, this is my note, that is a little averse to writing about contemporary politics and prefers a kind of temporal distance, that differs to the tradition in Pakistan of writing fiction in Pakistan, where there's maybe there's less of an aversion to writing about contemporary politics. Is that true? And can you tell me about that?
Well, I mean, if you look at sort of, you know, Pakistan's right, and again, I'm talking about writers in English, but you know, if you look at Mohsin Hamid, Nadeem Aslam, H.M. Naqvi, Moni Mohsin, Usma Aslam Khan, myself, we've all, you know, always been interested and write about the world as we see it. I do think it's changing. You know, you mentioned earlier Ali Smith, and Ali Smith, of course, with the seasonal quartet, you took that to a whole other level about really writing about the moment as it happens. I think the difference has to do with political urgency. So actually, I'd be interested to know how that plays out in Ireland with Irish fiction. But you know, if you're living in moments of political urgency, then actually even sort of 2 years ago, 3 years ago, feels quite historical and significant, and you're seeing all these consequences of it. So there's no question of waiting 50 years to write about something. You know, you can see already how 3 years ago has led to this and this and this, and so 3 years ago feels deeply historical and deeply consequential, and also because you don't have this idea of separating out politics from life, which is kind of a nonsense idea. And I think we're seeing that now. Again, I think countries like America and Britain are so aware. I mean, you know, COVID, if anything, taught us that the idea that our lives are separate from decisions made at the government level. Of course they're not. The government can say, okay, lockdown tomorrow. The government can say travel bans. The government can say you cannot walk into this space unless, you know, you have fulfilled these criteria. That your most intimate personal everyday life is subject to extreme control, which may be for the good, maybe for the bad, but it exists and it is to be reckoned with. I see we have a couple of questions coming.
Yeah, brilliant. So the first one there, you can probably see it as well, from Fatima Majoka. Mm-hmm. Growing up around the same era as you almost, and I really feel like you're telling stories about us, a certain Pakistani generation. It does make me feel heard, but what I want to ask you is this something you set out to do, to tell our stories?
No, but I'm glad you feel heard. I mean, I think the truth is, if you look at my earliest novels, and I suspect, Fatma, you're talking about those, the earliest novels were very much novels set in Karachi, and they were really me drawing on not autobiographical stuff, but you know, the times in the world I'd lived through. That very much changes with Burnt Shadows, which starts with the bombing of Nagasaki and then goes on to, you know, end in Guantanamo. And then A God in Every. So I actually did a quite dramatic shift, I think, because the next three novels were very, very far away from that world of, you know, a certain kind of generation and a certain kind of person in Pakistan. So there were three novels that went very distant from that. But as you say, we writers can't be consistent. So this one, Best of Friends, kind of goes back again to the world of those earlier novels for the first half, and then moves away for the second half. But no, I mean, I don't really, I've never set out to do anything with my fiction, you know. And I think it would be impossible to. I started my first novel when I was 21. You know, if I had set out to do something at 21, I hope that by the time I was 25, I would have reversed course in any case. So no, you keep changing, and the books change as well with you.
Yeah, and it's deadening, isn't it, to have an agenda? I mean,
Yeah.
you wouldn't write a book, I don't think. You couldn't live those years out.
No.
There's another question here from Abu Bakr Mahmoud. Is it tricky to capture the nuances of dialogue in an English novel for characters who are growing up in Karachi and might be speaking Urdu, or a mix of that and English?
So the characters within the novel are very much as I was, you know, English is very much their first language. But it's true that they would often, you know, it would be that kind of English with the reference points. And there are different ways to think about that. I think in some of the earlier novels, I had more of bringing in Urdu expressions or doing translated stuff, or, you know, working with certain kind of rhythms of speech. And then again, it became, well, I've done that. And I think when I started to write novels in which there were actually people speaking a lot of different languages, I thought, well, now I've got Japanese characters speaking in Japanese and German characters speaking in German. What am I going to do to bring in the Japaneseness or Germanness of this language when I don't know Japanese and German? And so then I think the decision became very much more, actually, I'll write them. They are speaking colloquially. And so what I'm going to do is have them speak colloquially, but in English. And the way in which that difference comes through is not so much in the use of language, but in how they see the world and how they talk about it and what their reference points are. So that tends to be more the way in which I now bring in that sense of, there are people, you know, who are not living in London, not living in New York.
Yeah, I think it always reads very specifically to me, you know, that I just don't think there's such a thing as kind of a novel in the English language that's neutral. I think the characters are always coming from somewhere, and that comes through. Your mother, I believe, was a journalist, or is a journalist, and an editor, and your great aunt was a novelist, and your grandfather was a memoirist. Did you ever try and you know, threaten them with studying law or accountancy?
No one ever wanted me to be a writer, and no one ever wanted me to not be a writer. Because also, when I hear this given, and I often do have this kind of question, because it's sort of given back to me in this way that assumes that everyone was sort of a successful published writer. And actually that wasn't the case. And my mother was writing for the newspapers. And around the time my first novel came out was when actually her life as a serious editor and writer, compiler of anthologies, took off. But when I was growing up, she was sort of, you know, writing about books and thinking about other kind of writing she could do. My great aunt had been published in the 1960s, which was a long time before, you know, felt like a long time ago. Had these two novels, one book of short stories and one novel out. Everyone in my family was always sort of writing away. My grandmother's memoirs were published when she was in her 80s, by which point I was on my fifth novel. So I wasn't growing up with a grandmother who was a writer. that happened to her later on. So I think what was relevant was I grew up in a world where everyone was sort of, writing was just what people did, and they would read all the time and they would talk about the books they were reading. But it wasn't a profession for most people. It was just a thing you did, and some got it published and some didn't get it published. And so I think when I went off to study creative writing at university, everyone sort of was looking at me like, what is that? Why?
And have you been back to the University of Massachusetts since then?
Yeah, I go and visit often. A lot of my friends stayed in the area, and I've gone and done readings there, which is always nice to go back as, the writer who wrote her first novel in the program and is now, all these years later, still at it.
Lovely. One last question before Javier, I think, will join us for housekeeping, and to encourage people to pick up the book, which they absolutely must. Wonderful, wonderful company is this book. I wanted to just ask, because there's a lot of popular culture is kind of one of the touchstones of their friendship, and George Michael is one of the references that comes up. Did you listen to, do you write to music? Did you listen to a soundtrack as you were writing?
No, I never understand writers who can. No, because I just get distracted by the music, and particularly as I listen to George Michael, why would I be paying attention to my words when I can listen to George Michael? So no, but I did enjoy putting music in and thinking back to the music of my adolescent years when I was writing it.
Yeah, because it does carry friendships a long way,
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kamila.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, the both of you, for being here today. We have multiple copies of both books. The holidays are right around the corner. Stock up while you can. And thanks, Beth, for doing the back end today. And Caoilinn and Kamila, thank you so much. That was an incredible conversation, and I'm glad that we record these so that we can relive them at a later date. And we get tons of people watch these after the fact and buy books. So thank you for being here. And we will see you soon again, Caoilinn. And thanks, you always come prepared. I say this every time. I hope it doesn't get old, but we really do appreciate you. And I was telling Kamila that we have not met in person yet. It's going to be really weird when we do, because we spent so much time on Zoom together over the last 2 years. But thank you again. And thank you.
I'll hug you. I'm going to warn you. I hope you don't mind.
Oh no, I don't. It's going to be so weird. It's going to be very emotional, but I can't wait for it to happen. So get here. And Kamila, please come into Chicago at some point. We'd love to see you here.
I might hug you as well, Javier.
That's fine. That is okay.
Caoilinn, I'll hug you when we meet. Lots of hugging all around.
It's
yes,
a deal.
there you go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for showing up and enjoying the great conversation. We'll see you next time. And have a good day or night, wherever you are.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye, Caoilinn.